They called me BTK. Bind, torture, kill. For 31 years, I made fools of everyone. The police, the FBI, the media, an entire city. I lived among them, shopped at their grocery stores, enforced their city codes, told them to trim their hedges and mow their lawns. And they had no idea that the man lecturing them about property violations was the monster who had been terrorizing Wichita since 1974. 10 victims, 10 carefully planned executions, and then silence, complete silence for 13 years. The case went cold. The city tried to move on. They thought I was dead. They thought I'd moved away. They thought maybe I'd been caught for something else. They were wrong about everything. I didn't stop because I was caught. I didn't stop because I felt guilty. I stopped because life got busy. Because being a husband, a father, a compliance officer takes time. Because blending in required effort. But I never forgot. I relived every moment, every struggle, every look of terror. I kept souvenirs, photographs, drawings, documents, hidden in my home, in my office, right under everyone's noses. By 2004, something changed. 30 years had passed since my first kill, the Otero family, January 15th, 1974, a date burned into Wichita's history. 4 people dead in one morning, and the city was starting to forget. A newspaper article suggested maybe BTK hadn't existed at all. Maybe it was multiple killers. Maybe the police had exaggerated the connections. That was unacceptable. I had worked too hard, planned too carefully. I deserved recognition. I deserved credit for my work. So I decided to remind them. I would come back. I would prove I was real. I would show them I was still smarter than everyone. What I didn't know was that technology had changed. The world I'd mastered in the 70s and 80s wasn't the same world anymore. Digital footprints, metadata, DNA analysis, computer forensics, things I didn't understand, things I underestimated, and that ignorance would be my downfall. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how the BTK killer finally got caught, you need to understand how I got away with it for so long. You need to see inside the mind of someone who lived 2 lives perfectly, who balanced normalcy and monstrosity without anyone suspecting a thing. This is the story of how I hunted Wichita, how I taunted police, how I sent them letters and poems and packages, how I asked them if a floppy disk could be traced, and how I believed them when they said no. Before we go further, I want to hear from you. Have you ever lived in a place where an unsolved case haunted the community? Drop a comment below and tell us your story. And if you're interested in more deep dives into criminal psychology and infamous cases, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, January 1974, a cold winter morning in Wichita, Kansas. The Otero family had no idea their lives were about to end, and I had no idea I was about to become BTK.
I chose them randomly. That's what made it perfect. No connection, no motive, no reason for police to ever link me to them. The Oteros were just a family living their lives, completely unaware that I'd been watching their house, learning their patterns, waiting for the right moment. Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and their 5 children. I knew the older kids would be at school. I knew the father would be home. I planned to be in and out quickly. 1 victim, maybe 2. That was the original plan. Plans change. That morning, I cut their phone line. I knocked on the door. When Joseph answered, I told him I was there to rob them, that I wouldn't hurt anyone if they cooperated. It was a lie, of course. I'd brought my kit, rope, tape, a knife, a gun, everything I needed. I tied them up in different rooms. Joseph and Julie, their 9-year-old son Joey, their 11-year-old daughter Josephine. I told them it would be okay. Another lie. I strangled Joseph first, then Julie. The children watched their parents die. Can you imagine that terror? That helplessness? Joey fought. He was small, but he struggled. It took longer than I expected. And Josephine? I saved her for last. I took her to the basement. I hanged her. And before I left, I did something that would become part of my signature. I arranged her body, positioned it. I took pleasure in the staging. 4 people dead in one house. A family destroyed in a single morning. The other Otero children came home from school to find their family murdered. The crime scene was so horrific that seasoned detectives walked out of that house shaking. And me? I went to work. I went home to my wife. I acted normal. Because I was normal. This was just another part of who I was. The police were baffled. Who kills an entire family for no reason? There was no sexual assault, nothing was stolen, no clear motive, just rope marks and terror and death. They had no idea this was just the beginning. 3 months later, I struck again. April 1974. Catherine Bright was 21 years old. I broke into her house and waited. When she came home with her brother Kevin, I told him the same lie. I was a fugitive who needed money and a car. I just needed to tie them up and I'd leave. Kevin believed me. Catherine didn't. She fought harder than anyone I'd ever encountered. She refused to die easily. I stabbed her multiple times. I shot her twice, and she still fought. Her brother escaped with serious injuries and ran for help. Catherine died later at the hospital, but she'd done something no one else had managed. She'd hurt me, scratched me, made me bleed. For the first time, I realized I wasn't invincible. I could be injured. I could make mistakes. That should have stopped me. It didn't. Instead, I got better, more careful, more methodical. I started selecting victims who lived alone, women I could control more easily. I developed rituals, fantasies I needed to fulfill. The killing wasn't enough anymore. I needed the process, the anticipation, the stalking, the moment they realized what was happening. Between 1974 and 1977, Wichita lived in fear. Women bought guns, installed better locks, traveled in groups. The police investigated hundreds of tips, interviewed thousands of people. Found nothing. Because I was invisible. A Boy Scout leader, a church usher, a family man. Nobody suspects the helpful neighbor. Nobody questions the guy who volunteers at community events. And I loved it. The fear, the attention, the knowledge that an entire city was looking for me and couldn't find me, even though I was right there. But by 1978, I was frustrated. The media wasn't giving me enough credit. They were focused on other suspects, other theories. They didn't understand the artistry of my work. So I decided to introduce myself properly.
October 1974. 7 months after the Otero murders, I sent my first letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper. I hid it inside a book at the public library, with instructions directing them to check a specific location. When they found it, they discovered something that would change everything. The letter described the Otero murders in detail. Details only I could know. I took credit. I explained my process. And I did something that would define the next 3 decades. I suggested names for myself. The possibility of a killer, psychotic killer adrift in society is not an unusual phenomena. I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurts me as well as society. Society can be thankful that there are ways for people like me to relieve myself at times by daydreams of some victims being tortured and being mine. My spelling wasn't perfect, my grammar was rough, but the message was clear. I was real, I was dangerous, and I wasn't finished. In that same letter, I suggested several possible names for the media to call me. The BTK Strangler, the Wichita Strangler, the Poetic Strangler, the Wichita Hangman, or simply BTK. BTK stuck. Bind, torture, kill. 3 words that perfectly captured my method. The media loved it. They gave me exactly what I wanted: a name, an identity, recognition. The police task force expanded. The FBI got involved. Profilers started building psychological profiles. They said I was probably white, mid-20s to mid-30s, intelligent but not highly educated, likely worked a blue-collar job, possibly military background, definitely organized and methodical. They were right about almost everything, except they couldn't find me. December 1977. 3 years after announcing myself, I killed Shirley Vian. She was 26 years old, a mother. I broke into her home while her children were there. I locked the kids in the bathroom and told them their mother would be okay if they stayed quiet. Another lie. I strangled Shirley while her children waited in the next room. When I left, those kids came out to find their mother dead. The psychological damage I inflicted that day went far beyond one victim. 2 months later, February 1978, I killed Nancy Fox. She was 25. I called the police afterward from a payphone to report the murder. I wanted them to find her quickly. I didn't want her body to decompose before they could see my work. You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing. Nancy Fox. That was all I said before hanging up. The dispatcher thought it was a prank until officers arrived and found Nancy dead in her bed. Strangled. Arranged. Another perfect execution. After Nancy's murder, I sent another letter. This one was different. More detailed. More brazen. I included a poem about Shirley Vian. I drew a diagram of the scene. I was taunting them now, showing them I was smarter, that I could kill and get away with it, and then mock them for their failure to catch me. Shirley locks, wilt thou be mine? Thou shalt not wash nor feed the swine, but sit on a cushion and sew a fine seam, and feast upon strawberries, sugar and cream. A children's nursery rhyme twisted into a trophy. The media ate it up. The city was terrified, and I was famous. But then something unexpected happened. The pressure got intense. The police were everywhere. My wife was pregnant with our second child. My job demanded more time. The thrill was still there, but the risk was increasing. So I made a decision that would define the next phase of my life. I would go quiet. Not forever, just until the heat died down. Until people stopped looking so carefully at every white man in his 30s who fit the profile. I killed one more time in 1986. Maureen Hedge, my neighbor. I'd watched her for months, waited for the perfect opportunity. I broke into her house, strangled her, took her body to my church where I photographed it, then disposed of her in a ditch outside of town. And then, silence. For 5 years before Maureen, nothing. For 13 years after Maureen, nothing. I vanished. The task force slowly disbanded. The case went cold. People moved on. New detectives took over who'd never worked the original investigations. The world forgot about BTK. But I never forgot about the world.
Between 1986 and 2004, I lived what most people would call a normal life. I worked for Park City as a compliance officer. I cited people for overgrown yards, barking dogs, abandoned cars. I had authority, a badge. I could knock on doors and people had to let me in. The irony wasn't lost on me. BTK was now enforcing city ordinances. The man who'd terrorized Wichita was telling people their trash cans were the wrong color. I was good at my job, thorough, detail-oriented, maybe a little too strict, according to some residents. I wrote tickets for minor violations. I followed up aggressively. Some people complained I was a power-hungry bureaucrat who enjoyed his small authority too much. They had no idea how right they were. At home, I was Dennis Rader, husband to Paula, father to 2 children. We attended Christ Lutheran Church, where I was president of the Congregation Council. I installed security systems as a side job. I was a Cub Scout leader. I helped with community events. My daughter didn't know. My son didn't know. My wife didn't know. Nobody knew. I compartmentalized perfectly. When I was Dennis Rader, I was completely Dennis Rader. Family man, church leader, code enforcement officer. And when I was BTK, when I retreated into my fantasies and relived my work, that was a completely separate existence. I kept everything. Photographs of victims, drawings I'd made, documents detailing my crimes, newspaper clippings about the investigations. I hid them in my home, in my office, in places where my family would never look. I created elaborate fantasy scenarios. I would imagine new victims, plan theoretical attacks, draw detailed sketches of bondage positions, write stories about my kills. It was enough. Almost enough. But by the early 2000s, the fantasy was wearing thin. I was getting older, approaching 60. How much longer could I enjoy this if no one remembered? What good was being BTK if the world had moved on? In 2004, 2 things happened that sealed my fate. First, a Wichita Eagle reporter was working on a series about the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. The articles questioned whether BTK was even real, whether one person had committed all these crimes, whether the police had connected cases that weren't actually related. This enraged me. How dare they question my work? How dare they suggest I wasn't real? Second, a book was published about the BTK case. It speculated about who I might have been. It got details wrong. It misrepresented my motivations. It failed to give me proper credit. That was the final straw. I decided to come back, to prove I was real, to reclaim my narrative, to remind Wichita that BTK had never really left. I would communicate with police again, send them evidence they couldn't deny, proof that I was the real BTK, that I was still here, still smarter than them. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly understand, was that I was planning my comeback in a different world. The technology that barely existed in the 80s had evolved beyond my comprehension. DNA databases were now massive and interconnected. Surveillance cameras were everywhere. Cell phone records could track movements. Computer forensics could extract data from deleted files. And most important, metadata embedded in digital documents could trace them back to specific computers, specific printers, specific locations. But I didn't know any of that. I was operating with 1970s knowledge in a 2000s world, and that gap between what I knew and what was now possible would destroy me. In March 2004, I sent my first communication in 13 years. I left it at a Home Depot in Wichita. It contained items that would prove beyond doubt that BTK was back. The game was on again, and I was certain I would win.
March 17, 2004. I prepared my first package in over a decade. Inside a manila envelope, I placed 3 items that would prove I was the real BTK. A photocopy of Vicky Wegerle's driver's license. Vicky had been murdered in 1986, but police had never officially connected her death to BTK. Now I would give them proof. I also included photos I'd taken of her body and a detailed drawing of how I'd bound her. This wasn't just claiming credit. This was providing evidence only I could possess. I dropped the package in the bed of a random pickup truck at a Home Depot parking lot. The truck owner found it and turned it in to police. Within hours, the BTK task force was reformed. Detectives who'd worked the original cases came out of retirement. The FBI sent agents. The media descended on Wichita like a storm. I was back. The reaction was everything I'd hoped for. Front page news, television specials, national attention. Police held press conferences where they addressed me directly, asking me to communicate with them, to help them understand. They wanted to talk? Perfect. I had plenty to say. Between March 2004 and February 2005, I sent 11 communications, each one more elaborate than the last. I was enjoying this. The attention, the fear, the power. In May 2004, I left a package at a UPS drop box. Inside was a word puzzle that spelled out the name of my next claimed victim. Except there was no next victim. I was playing games, seeing if they could decode my messages. They could. The media published the puzzle solution. They were publicizing my work exactly as I wanted. In June, I sent a package to a Wichita TV station. It contained a fake ID card I'd created with the name Bill Thomas Kilman, BTK. Get it? I thought it was clever. I also included a word search puzzle and more details about my crimes. The police analyzed everything. Forensics teams examined the paper, the ink, the adhesive on envelopes. Profilers updated their assessments. They knew I was local. They knew I was older now. They knew I was narcissistic and craved recognition. But they still didn't know who I was. In October, I sent a package with jewelry I'd taken from victims. Evidence they could test. Evidence that would prove conclusively these crimes were connected. I was giving them everything they needed to confirm what I already knew. I was BTK. I was real. I was unstoppable. By December 2004, I had sent so many communications that police were cataloging them like exhibits in a museum. Package A through K. Each one analyzed frame by frame, word by word, looking for the mistake I'd eventually make. Except I wasn't going to make a mistake. I was too careful, too smart. Or so I thought. That same December, I started wondering about technology. The world had changed since my last communication in 1991. Computers were everywhere now. People use them for everything. I used one at work. I used one at church. I'd been sending handwritten letters and physical items, but what if I could send digital communications? That would be faster, more efficient, less risky than physically placing packages around the city. But could they trace a computer disk? Could they figure out who sent it? I didn't know. Technology wasn't my strength. So I decided to ask them. In December 2004, I sent a communication with a question. Can I communicate with Floppy and not be traced to a computer? Be honest. Be honest. I actually asked the police to be honest with me. The same police I'd been taunting for 30 years. The same police who'd been trying to catch me since 1974. And I expected them to tell me the truth? Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, head of the BTK task force, saw his opportunity. This was the break they'd been waiting for. I was asking about technology I didn't understand. Technology that could be traced. Landwehr placed an ad in the Wichita Eagle that addressed me directly. Rex, it will be okay. Rex was one of my code names, and it will be okay was his answer to my question. Yes, I could communicate with a floppy disk. No, they couldn't trace it. It was a lie, but I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I'd been communicating with police for decades. They'd never lied to me before. They'd been honest in their press conferences. They'd published my messages. They'd given me the attention I deserved. I trusted them. That was my biggest mistake.
February 2005. I prepared what would be my final communication. I was excited. This was going to be more efficient than physical packages. I could send longer messages, more detailed information. I could really show off my intelligence. I went to work at City Hall. I sat down at my computer, I opened Microsoft Word, and created a document. I wrote about my crimes. I included details. I saved the file to a purple floppy disk. Then, I deleted the file from the computer, emptied the recycle bin. I thought that meant it was gone, that there was no trace of it on that machine. I was wrong about that, too. I drove to a Wichita Home Depot and left the floppy disk on the bed of a pickup truck in the parking lot, just like I'd done before. The truck owner found it and turned it in to police. February 16, 2005. The BTK task force received my purple floppy disk. Every detective in that room knew this could be the break they needed. They'd lied to me about whether a disk could be traced. Now they had to deliver. They gave the disk to their computer forensics team. Within hours, the team had recovered the deleted file. And embedded in that file was metadata, digital information automatically attached to every Microsoft Word document. The metadata showed the document had last been modified by someone named Dennis, and it showed the document had been created on a computer at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. Dennis, Christ Lutheran Church. Two pieces of information that had just narrowed down the suspect pool from thousands to dozens. Detectives immediately started researching Christ Lutheran Church. Who worked there? Who had access to their computers? Who was named Dennis? They found me. Dennis Rader, president of the Congregation Council, longtime member, someone who would have keys to the building, someone who would have access to church computers. They pulled up my information. White male, age 60, lived in Park City near several of the crime scenes, worked as a compliance officer, which meant I could enter people's homes legally. I fit the profile. I had opportunity. I had access. But they needed more than coincidence. They needed proof. Investigators started surveillance. They followed me to work, to home, to church. They watched my routines. They cataloged my movements. And they started digging into my past. Employment records showed I'd worked as an ADT security installer in the 1970s. That was significant. Several BTK victims had been approached by someone claiming to be a security system installer. I'd been in the Air Force in the 1960s. The military connection matched the profile. I'd been living in Wichita during every single BTK murder. No gaps, no alibis. Perfect opportunity. But surveillance and circumstantial evidence weren't enough. They needed DNA. Here's where it gets clever. Police knew I had a daughter. They knew my daughter had been to the Kansas State University Medical Clinic. They obtained a warrant for her medical records, specifically for a pap smear sample stored at the clinic. They tested that sample. They extracted DNA, and they compared it to DNA recovered from BTK crime scenes. It wasn't a perfect match. It couldn't be. It was my daughter's DNA, not mine. But it was close enough to establish familial relationship, close enough to prove that BTK's DNA and this sample came from a parent and child. I was BTK. They had me. Now they just had to catch me without spooking me, without giving me a chance to destroy evidence or run. They had to be as careful in their endgame as I'd been in my crimes. February 25, 2005, 9 days after receiving my purple floppy disk, I was driving through Park City when police pulled me over. Multiple cars, multiple officers. They approached with guns drawn. I was arrested for parking violations and an outstanding warrant. That was the official reason. The real reason was sitting in an evidence room, a purple floppy disk that had betrayed me. At the police station, detectives sat me down. They didn't immediately reveal what they knew. They wanted to see if I'd talk, if I'd confess, if my narcissism would betray me one more time. Lieutenant Landwehr looked across the table at me and asked a simple question. "Do you know why you're here?" I smiled. "Oh, I have my suspicions." The interrogation room at the Wichita Police Department was small and unremarkable. Gray walls, a metal table, uncomfortable chairs, recording equipment capturing every word, every facial expression, every moment of what would become one of the most disturbing confessions in American criminal history. I sat calmly. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't scared. If anything, I felt relieved, excited even. After 31 years of hiding, of compartmentalizing, of living two lives, I could finally be myself completely. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr and other detectives started slowly. They didn't accuse me directly. They danced around the subject, watching my reactions, building rapport. "Dennis, we need to talk to you about some things." "Okay." My voice was steady, pleasant even. "Do you know why you're here?" I smiled again. "Oh, I have my suspicions." "What suspicions would those be?" Long pause. I looked at the detectives, reading them, calculating. Then I made my decision. BTK. Just like that. One word, 3 letters. My confession had begun. The detectives didn't react with surprise. They'd expected this. Narcissists like me couldn't help themselves. Given the opportunity to talk about our work, to finally receive credit, we would confess to everything. "You're BTK?" Landwehr asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Yes." "Can you tell us about it?" And I did. For hours I talked. I described each murder in meticulous detail. I explained my methods, my planning, my rituals. I spoke about my victims like they were projects I'd completed, problems I'd solved, challenges I'd overcome. I talked about the Otero family, how I'd watched their house, how I'd planned to kill just the father but circumstances changed, how the children had fought harder than I expected. I showed no remorse, no emotion. I was describing my work the way an accountant might describe filing taxes. I talked about Catherine Bright and how she'd injured me, about Shirley Vian and her children locked in the bathroom, about Nancy Fox and the phone call I'd made afterward, about every victim, every crime scene, every detail the police had spent decades trying to piece together. The detectives asked about the floppy disk. "You told me it would be okay," I said, sounding almost hurt. "You said it couldn't be traced." "We lied," Landwehr said simply. I nodded, accepting this. I wasn't angry. I was impressed. Good strategy. I would have done the same thing. I was complimenting them on catching me, admiring their tactics. This wasn't defeat. This was finally finding worthy opponents. They asked why I'd come back, why risk everything after 13 years of silence. I explained the article, the newspaper article that questioned whether BTK was real. I couldn't let that stand. I needed people to know, to remember. I'd worked too hard to be forgotten. My ego destroyed me, my need for recognition, my inability to accept that the world had moved on. That's what brought me down. Not brilliant detective work, though that helped. Not advances in forensic science, though those were crucial. My downfall was me. BTK destroyed BTK. The confession lasted hours. By the end, detectives had clearance on every BTK crime. They had details only I could know. They had admissions that would make conviction inevitable. But they also had something else, a window into my mind, a mind that most people couldn't comprehend. I wasn't insane by legal standards. I knew right from wrong. I understood the consequences of my actions. I simply didn't care. I'd killed because I wanted to, because it satisfied something inside me, because I enjoyed it. That was the terrifying truth. Not mental illness, not trauma, not even hatred. Just desire, just pleasure, just the fulfillment of fantasies I'd been nurturing since childhood. When the interrogation finally ended,
I was returned to my cell. I had confessed to everything, given them everything, and I felt content, relieved even. For the first time in 30 decades, I could stop pretending to be normal. I could stop hiding. I could be BTK completely. I just had to do it from a prison cell.
February 26th, 2005, the day after my arrest. Wichita woke up to news that would shatter everything they thought they knew about their community. BTK had been caught, and it was me. Not a transient, not a drifter passing through, not someone from outside who'd terrorized their city and disappeared. Me, Dennis Rader, Park City Compliance Officer, Christ Lutheran Church Council President, Boy Scout leader, husband, father, neighbor. The press conference was packed. Cameras from national networks, reporters from around the world. The police chief stood at the podium and announced what everyone had feared and suspected since my arrest. We have BTK in custody. His name is Dennis Rader. The media erupted. Questions shouted from every direction. How long had they known? What evidence did they have? How many victims? Was I confessing? But the real devastation was happening outside that press conference, in homes, in churches, and neighborhoods across Wichita. People who knew me were trying to process the impossible. The man who'd installed their security systems was BTK. The man who'd cited them for code violations was BTK. The man who'd led their children in Boy Scouts was BTK. Paula, my wife, was destroyed. Police had shown up at her workplace and escorted her out. They'd told her about my arrest, about my confession, about the 31 years she'd been married to me without knowing. She filed for divorce immediately. She gave a brief statement to media through her lawyer. The family wants the community to know that our family had no knowledge of his criminal activities. We are shocked and horrified by what has unfolded. My children, now adults, were equally traumatized. They'd grown up with me as their father. Strict, yes, controlling, certainly. But a monster? A killer? They couldn't accept it. Except they had to. It was true. My co-workers at City Hall were interviewed by police. Had they noticed anything suspicious, any red flags, any indication that the man who wrote tickets for overgrown lawns was capable of murder? No. Nothing. I was rigid, detail-oriented, maybe a little too enthusiastic about my authority, but dangerous? No one had suspected. Christ Lutheran Church held a meeting. Members wept. How could their congregation president, the man who'd led them in prayer, who'd managed their finances, who'd volunteered countless hours, be BTK? Pastor Michael Clark addressed the congregation. We are all struggling to understand how someone we knew and trusted could have committed these horrific acts. We pray for the victims and their families, and we pray for strength to process this betrayal. But the worst pain was felt by my surviving victims, the family members who'd spent 30 years wondering who had killed their loved ones, why they'd been targeted, whether I would ever be caught. Now they had answers, and those answers made everything worse.
June 27, 2005. The Sedgwick County Courthouse was transformed into a fortress. Security was unprecedented. Media from around the world crowded the streets. Victim families filled the courtroom. And I, wearing a prison jumpsuit, stood before a judge to enter my plea. There would be no trial in the traditional sense. I'd confessed to everything. My lawyers had advised me to plead guilty, to spare the families the trauma of a trial, to accept responsibility. But really, I wanted to plead guilty for a different reason. A trial meant lawyers doing the talking. A trial meant restrictions on what I could say. A guilty plea meant victim impact statements. It meant I'd get to hear my work described, my impact detailed. It meant attention. One final performance. How do you plead to count 1, the murder of Joseph Otero? Guilty. Count 2, the murder of Julie Otero? Guilty. 10 times the judge read the charges. 10 times I said guilty. 1 for each victim. 1 for each life I'd taken.
But saying guilty wasn't enough for me. I wanted to explain, to describe, to relive my crimes in front of an audience. Against my lawyer's advice, I asked to make a statement. The judge allowed it, that for the next hour, I described my crimes in clinical, disturbing detail. I called my victims projects. I explained my factor X, my term for the compulsion to kill. I described how I'd select victims, how I'd stalk them, how I'd gain entry to their homes. I showed charts I'd created, diagrams of crime scenes, lists of my hits. I'd turned my confession into a presentation, like I was teaching a class on murder. The courtroom was silent except for my voice. Victim family members wept. Some couldn't stay in the room. Others forced themselves to listen, to bear witness, to face the man who'd destroyed their lives. I showed no emotion, no remorse. I was matter-of-fact, descriptive, proud of my work, even as I admitted its horror. When I finished, the judge asked if anyone wanted to make victim impact statements. They did. Many of them. Charlie Otero spoke about finding his family murdered, about the life he could have had if I hadn't destroyed it, about the little brother and sister who never got to grow up, about parents who never got to see their children become adults. Beverly Plapp, Nancy Fox's sister, described the agony of losing Nancy, the decades of wondering, the fear that I would never be caught. One by one they spoke. Their pain filled the courtroom. Their loss was palpable. And through it all, I sat expressionless. I'd heard what I wanted to hear, the impact of my work, the fear I'd created, the suffering that would last long after I was gone. When the statements ended, Judge Gregory Waller addressed me directly. Mr. Rader, you have pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. You have shown no remorse. You have treated this proceeding as an opportunity to relive your crimes. I can only conclude that you are an evil man. Evil. Not insane, not sick, evil. The sentence for each count is life imprisonment. These sentences will run consecutively. This means you will serve a minimum of 175 years before being eligible for parole. I was 60 years old. I would die in prison. I would never be free again. As officers led me from the courtroom, I turned and looked at the gallery one last time. My family wasn't there. Paula had divorced me. My children had disowned me. The congregation I'd led had expelled me. I was alone. Finally. Completely alone. Except for my victims. They would be with me forever.
I'm currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. I will never be eligible for parole. I will die behind bars. And even in death, I'll be remembered not as Dennis Rader, but as BTK, the identity I created, the monster I became. But my story raises questions that extend far beyond one serial killer in Wichita, Kansas. How do monsters hide among you? I wasn't a recluse. I wasn't a loner living in isolation. I was active in my community. I had a family, friends, colleagues, people who interacted with me daily for decades without suspecting anything. Criminal psychologists have studied my case extensively. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who interviewed me in prison, wrote that I represent a specific type of killer, the organized, narcissistic offender who sees murder as personal achievement. Dennis Rader didn't kill out of rage or psychosis, Dr. Ramsland explained. He killed because it fulfilled a fantasy he'd been cultivating since childhood. He saw his victims as objects in his personal narrative,
props in a story where he was the protagonist. This is what makes cases like mine so terrifying. You want to believe that monsters look like monsters, that evil announces itself, that you'd recognize a killer if you sat next to one at church or worked alongside one at the office. But I prove that's not how it works. I compartmentalized perfectly. When I was with my family, I was genuinely present as a father and husband. When I was at work, I took my job seriously. When I was at church, I participated authentically in worship and community service. And when I was alone with my fantasies, when I was planning and stalking and killing, that was a completely separate existence. These weren't different personalities. This wasn't dissociative identity disorder. This was one man, me, who could turn different aspects of myself on and off like light switches. The psychological term is functional psychopathy. The ability to understand social norms, to mimic empathy, to maintain relationships while lacking genuine emotional connection to others. I could appear normal because I understood how normal people behaved. I studied it, practiced it, perfected it. But underneath that performance was something fundamentally different, a void where empathy should exist. A capacity for violence that I satisfied methodically, like someone else might satisfy hunger or thirst. In prison interviews, I've shown no evolution, no remorse. I still refer to my victims as projects. I still describe my crimes with pride. I've written letters to media, to researchers, to anyone who will pay attention. Because that's what I need. Attention. Recognition. The knowledge that people remember BTK. My daughter, Carrie Rawson, has written about the experience of learning I was a serial killer. In her book, A Serial Killer's Daughter, she describes the psychological devastation, the way it shattered her understanding of her childhood, the way it made her question every memory, every moment she'd spent with me. I have to live with the fact that half my DNA comes from a monster, that the man who taught me to ride a bike, who came to my school events, who walked me down the aisle at my wedding, was also capable of unimaginable cruelty. My case changed how law enforcement approaches cold cases. The use of familial DNA, the strategy of lying to suspects about untraceable technology, the importance of maintaining evidence even decades after crimes occur, all of these became standard practices partly because of lessons learned from catching me. It also changed how people think about community safety. Wichita learned that locking doors and installing security systems wasn't enough. Not when the monster was the one installing those systems. Not when danger came from inside the community rather than outside it. The purple floppy disk that led to my arrest is now in an evidence storage facility. It sits alongside the rope I used, the sketches I drew, the photographs I took, physical remnants of horror, proof that BTK was real. But the most lasting evidence isn't in storage. It's in the survivors, in the family members who still carry trauma from crimes I committed decades ago, in the community that learned to fear its own neighbors, in the children who grew up without parents because I decided their family would be my first project. 10 people died because my fantasies mattered more to me than human life. 4 members of the Otero family, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wergley, and Dolores Davis.
Say their names. Remember them not as my victims, but as people, as parents and children and siblings and friends, as lives that mattered, as losses that echo through generations. Because that's the real story here. Not the cleverness of my crimes or the drama of my capture. The real story is the human cost, the permanent damage one person, me, can inflict when I decide other people's lives are less important than my own desires. I wanted to be remembered. I wanted immortality through infamy. I wanted the name BTK to live forever. But you should remember me differently. Not as the clever killer who eluded police for 31 years,
not as the master manipulator who hid in plain sight. Remember me as the man who threw away everything, my family, my freedom, my humanity, for the temporary satisfaction of violent fantasies. Remember me as the cautionary tale, the reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself, that monsters sometimes look exactly like everyone else. And remember that my capture came down to one thing: my own narcissism, my need to be recognized, my inability to accept being forgotten. That ego destroyed me. That pride led me to send a floppy disk I didn't understand, to trust police I shouldn't have trusted, to make the mistake that ended 3 decades of freedom. I'm 69 years old now. I'll likely die in prison within the next decade or two. When I do, there won't be mourners at my funeral. My family has moved on. My community has forgotten me. Even my notoriety has faded as newer crimes capture public attention. I'll die alone, which is exactly what I deserve, because I chose that isolation. I chose violence over family. I chose fantasy over reality. I chose to be BTK. And BTK ends not with a bang, not with drama, not with the recognition I craved. I end with silence, with obscurity, with the slow, unremarkable passage of time in a prison cell. That's the real ending for monsters like me. Not the theatrical capture, not the sensational trial, just the boring, inevitable consequence of my choices. Just time. Just justice. Just the slow fade into irrelevance. We started this story with a question. How did I get away with it for 31 years? The answer is simpler than you might think. I got away with it because I was careful, because technology hadn't caught up yet, because I stopped killing when the risk got too high, because I blended in. But the better question is, why didn't I get away with it in the end? And that answer is even simpler. I couldn't stay quiet. I couldn't accept being forgotten. My ego demanded recognition, and that demand destroyed me. There's a lesson there, not just for criminals, but for everyone. The things we think make us special, the recognition we crave, the legacy we want to leave. Sometimes those desires lead us to make choices that destroy everything we've built. I wanted to be remembered as BTK, the clever killer, the one who got away with it for decades. Instead, I'll be remembered as the narcissist who asked police if a floppy disk could be traced, believed them when they lied, and then sent them the evidence that would lock me away forever. I'll be remembered as the man who couldn't resist one final performance, who needed attention more than I needed freedom. I'll be remembered as the killer who caught himself. And maybe that's the most fitting end for me. Not caught by brilliant detective work, though that played a role. Not undone by forensic science, though that sealed my fate. Undone by my own hand. Destroyed by the very thing that had defined me for 30 decades. My need to be seen. My need to be feared. My need to be BTK. In the end, that need was stronger than my survival instinct, stronger than my intelligence, stronger than 31 years of careful hiding. And it put me exactly where I belong, in a cell, forgotten by everyone except the families whose lives I destroyed. That's justice. Not perfect, not complete. Nothing can undo what I did. Nothing can bring back my victims or heal the trauma I inflicted. But it's something. It's consequence. It's accountability. It's the monster finally facing what he created. So what do you think? Did I catch myself, or did technology catch up with me? Was my arrest inevitable, or did my narcissism seal my fate? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into one of America's most disturbing serial killers compelling, hit that subscribe button. We're covering more cases like this. Criminals who thought they were smarter than everyone else until they weren't. Tell us what case you want us to cover next. Ted Bundy's final days, the Golden State Killer, the Zodiac mysteries. Let us know below. Thanks for watching, and remember, the monsters you fear most might be closer than you think. They might be the neighbor who waves every morning, the coworker who seems perfectly normal, the person sitting next to you at church. That's the real horror of my case. Not that monsters exist, but that we hide so well. Until next time, stay safe and stay skeptical.